But you are here for, or my name, first of all, is Jesse. Hey, I forget if I introduce myself. I'll be your presenter this evening. I want to give credit where credit is due. I got this information, including these slides, from a class that I took at Alpha Omega Institute. So I want to give them credit first off for this presentation. Y'all are here for the first session. We'll have 4. This is the first session, the supposed proofs of evolution. Well, first of all, what is evolution? You've probably heard of it. The idea of life coming from molecules. We had molecules floating around, random energy came in, somehow they aligned together in such a way that created the first living cell. And then you have cells, or this pool of life, so to speak, and eventually from that pool of life is evolving more complex life all the way up to mankind. Or as my professor would say, from goo to you by way of the zoo. That is what Darwinian evolution is in a nutshell. So we're talking about what are the supposed proofs of evolution. There's probably more than these, but we're going to cover these 3. Change, similarity, and fossils. These things are held up as proof that evolution is true. So let's first look at change. You know, the word evolution means change. And if we look in nature around us, do we see change? Yes, we do. So in a sense, we say, sure, we see evolution, but now the question is, how much change and what kind of change do we see in nature around us? Darwinian evolution is sometimes referred to as macroevolution. It's large change happening, change from one creature into another. That's a large amount of change taking place. And one of the examples that is given is Darwin's finches. Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, and as he went to these different islands, he saw these finches had different types of beaks. There was changes in the beak sizes and strength for these finches. Well, although we see this change within the finches, what did we start with? Finches. What did we end with? Finches. This isn't proof that the finches are changing into something else. We see a change still within the finch kind. Bacteria, we see a lot of change for bacteria, especially in our medical age that we are now. That bacteria can become resistant to certain medicines. It can change, it can adapt. But what did we start with? Bacteria. What did we end with? Bacteria. We don't see the bacteria changing into a new kind of living thing. Instead, what we observe, what science is observation and experimentation, what we observe is variation within a kind. We don't observe one kind changing into another. Dogs are really a better example than finches, right? All the variations we have we have dogs that exist now that didn't exist 100 years ago. So much variation within the genetic code of dogs, but they are all still the dog kind. They're all still the same kind of creature. They're not changing into a different kind of creature, even though you see someone with a leash, you're like, what is that rodent? What is that thing? Well, it may look like a rodent, but it's still a dog. But it's not changing into something else. And even if Darwinian evolution was true, wouldn't we see creatures that were in transition into another kind of creature? Does anyone see something like this hopping around today? Or if you were to go to the zoo, do you see some creature like this or like that? Are there any bird watchers around here? Do you ever see any bird like this flying around? Or anyone go hunting for one of these? No, we don't see creatures that are in the middle stages of becoming something else. Instead, we see something like this, a creature that is fully formed and continues to stay in that formation, that design as a creature. We also see variation within mankind, don't we? There's variation within our genetic makeup that allows there to be different kind of features, but it's not that mankind is changing into something else. There are also limits to how much change can exist within the human race. What we observe, what we can experiment with, we see variation within a kind of creature. Yes, creatures that can adapt to their environment, but those adaptations, those microevolutions, small changes, we don't see that leading to a new kind of creature, which shouldn't be surprising if you're familiar with Genesis chapter 1, where God says that He created animals to reproduce after their own kind. It says that 10 times, the very first book of the Bible, that they would reproduce after their own kind. And that's what we see around us. They are staying within their own kind. But according to evolution, there has to be some type of new genetic information being added to creatures that would eventually allow them to become something new. And what is the way in which new genetic information is supposedly added to creatures? Well, the idea is that it's mutation and natural selection, that those are the driving forces, you've probably heard them before, for producing change that eventually leads to a new type of creature. Well, let's look at mutation. According to observation, what we see, what do mutations produce? Well, mutations can produce two-headed snakes. And we might say, oh, is this a beneficial mutation? Well, perhaps the snake is able to see better and catch a mice that's running by with two heads rather than one. But if the snake is running away from a predator, don't you see the disadvantage of the fork hitting all the sticks and pieces of grass while it's trying to get away? This is not ultimately a beneficial mutation. Mutations can also produce five-legged cows. There's a leg coming off of the back of that cow. Is this a beneficial mutation? No, the leg is useless. The leg can't be used, and if anything, that's extra weight and increases chances of infection if that leg were to get injured. That is not a beneficial mutation. Mutations can also produce featherless roosters. Well, not only does this mutation make it more difficult for the rooster to engage with the ladies, but also it's making it more susceptible to the sun. The feathers are not protecting it from being sunburned and damaged. This is a harmful mutation for the rooster. But evolutionists will say, well, we just need so many generations and mutations to eventually produce the new genetic information of ultimately a new creature that evolution proposes. And so fruit flies can regenerate very rapidly. They have a short lifespan and they can reproduce very rapidly. So scientists they had generations and generations of fruit flies that they bombarded with radiation to produce mutations. And this is some of the things that they produce. So here's the normal fruit fly on the right. Sometimes they would be born with legs instead of antenna. They'd have dark bodies. They've had no wings. They've had curl wings. Okay, so we see change, but what did we start with? Fruit flies. What did we end with? Fruit flies. This isn't proof that the fruit flies are changing into something else. And actually, most of these mutations are actually harmful, such as this mutation that caused the fly to be born with 4 wings. But guess what? They say this mutation, this rare mutation like most, is harmful. Why? Because the fly couldn't fly. It couldn't fly with 4 wings. It was ultimately a harmful mutation for that fly. But they say at the end there, beneficial mutations are the raw natural material for natural selection. So again, the supposed beneficial mutations plus natural selection will produce some new genetic information. But that's not what Lee Spenter observes, who has a PhD in physics at MIT. He says, in all the readings I've done in life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied in the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not increase it. Those mutations are actually corrupting and harming the genetic code of creatures, where they're actually having less good information to the next generation because of those mutations. Not that there is new information truly being added. And that should make sense for us, that we aren't seeking to bombard ourselves with radiation to say, yay, mutations, aren't they wonderful? No, we know that mutations are harmful. Mutations cause loss, aging, duplication, disease, deformities, disaster, and death as a majority of the time. But what about the supposed beneficial mutations that perhaps could be considered a benefit? Well, do they produce the supposed new information that will eventually lead to another creature? That's not what Jonathan Wells believes, who has a PhD in molecular biology. He says there is no evidence that DNA mutations can provide the sorts of variation needed for evolution. There's no evidence for beneficial mutations at the level of macroevolution, large change, but there's also no evidence at the level of what is commonly regarded as microevolution, the small changes we see within a kind. So, mutation, does that prove that will ultimately produce a new information and a new creature? No, we don't see that in what we observe or even what we can reproduce in a lab. What about natural selection? What's natural selection? Well, in general, it's the pressures and conditions of the environment that supposedly will do away with one type of creature and their qualities, but it'll help to prosper another creature based off of their different qualities. It's nature supposedly selecting creatures to ultimately prosper. And one of the examples that is used is the peppered moth. Maybe you've seen that before. So we have the peppered moth, 2 different Two different designs on the peppered moth here, sitting on the white bark of a tree, that if a bird were to be flying by, which one of those moths do you think it's going to pick off? Well, probably the black one, right, because it stands out. But then after the Industrial Revolution, now the tree bark is darker, and they would say, which one now is the bird going to fly and pick off? Well, the white one, right? So that's nature selecting off the weaker, the poorer qualities, and allowing those that have good qualities to live on and prosper. Well, even though there's a lot that could be said about this supposed example, what did we start with? Moths. What did we end with? Moths. This isn't proof that the moths are turning into something else. No, mutation and natural selection are not creative mechanisms. We don't see them producing something truly new within creatures themselves, where they're becoming a new type of creature. So these proposed mechanisms of evolution, from what we observe and what we have experimented with, we see that no, they do not supposedly drive creatures to become something new, macroevolution. So this idea of change being proof of evolution, no, we don't see that. Well, what about similarity? You know, we look at creatures the way we are organized, structured, and some people will say, well, look at the joints within the various creatures. Look how similar they are. This proves that we have a common ancestor. We evolved from a common ancestor. Well, even if I lined up cars together in an order, would I say, well, that proves, look at the similarity. It proves that one car evolved from the other. No, it doesn't prove that. It just proves that whoever designed the cars said, man, there are certain features that are good to have in a car. And so we're going to use those features plus some extra things to create a car. Ernest Haeckel, in the late 1800s, came up with what he called the biogenetic law of ontogeny recapitulates phyology. And what he's basically saying there is he drew up, he made these drawings of these embryos of these different creatures, and he said, look at the similarities of these embryos. And especially mankind. Mankind is reproducing our evolutionary stages within the womb, that we all start out looking like a fish who we came from, and then in the womb we are eventually reproducing our evolutionary stages. And he even took the human embryo and he gave titles such as this. Look, it has gill slits, it has a yolk sac, it has a tail. Well, wait a minute. Is that really gill slits? No, it's not. It's not gill slits, nor has it become gills. Is this filled with yolk? No, it's not filled with yolk. It's filled with blood. And did anyone come in here dragging a tail behind them? No, this is not a tail, nor has it become a tail. It's the spinal cord that's simply longer than the rest of the body at this point, and the rest of the body will grow into it at a later stage. You see how misleading these terms are? That he was trying to push for this idea of look at the different stages of creatures that we used to be. No, these things are not accurate terms to give, and actually Ernest Haeckel got in trouble later because there are his drawings on the top, but here's what they actually look like in real life. Not very accurate. Where are they? No, and he was eventually denied as being true to science and the study of what he was doing. And here Professor Keith says in 1988, the biogenetic law that we discussed is as dead as a doornail. It was finally exorcised from the biology textbooks in the 50s, and as a topic of serious theoretical inquiry, it was extinct in the 20s. Wait a minute, so in the 1920s, scientists said this is clearly not a law of science, but how long was it in the textbooks? 30 years. 30 years it was in the textbook saying, look, proof of evolution, look at the similarity. We came from these creatures. Isn't that sad? And my professor actually says here in 1988 is when this was out, he says, no, it has not been completely expelled. You will still find it in some biology textbooks saying this is proof of evolution, this similarity, this law that Ernest Haeckel came up with. Well, another similarity you may have heard of is our DNA. Here's Time Magazine, 2006. Chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. Well, actually, that number is no longer accurate. Later research, Roy Britton, a biologist at California Institute of Technology, said in a study published that a new way of comparing the genes shows that the human and chimp genetic similarity is only about 95%. And actually, that number even went down again. Here's 2007. 6.4% of the 22,000-odd human genes are not present in chimps, making the gap between the two suddenly seem much wider. You see, we're still unpacking the human genome today. We haven't fully done it, but they compared what was similar in the human genome to what was similar in chimps and said, oh, look, 99%. But as we're unpacking the human genome, we're realizing, oh, it continues to be less and less and less similar. Here we are, 40,000 chimpanzee DNA sequences against the human genome, 86 to 89%. It keeps going down as we continue to unpack the human genome, and it could be getting as low as 70% similarity. But just because your DNA is similar, does that mean that you came from that creature? Did you know that we are 97.5% similar in DNA to a mouse? And that we're 92% similar DNA to a zebrafish? And we're 50% similar DNA to a banana? Does that prove we came from a banana? No, but it would make sense that if someone created and designed mankind and DNA to be the building block, he would put DNA in creatures and it would look similar in its building and organizing capabilities. Tree of life, probably seen things such as this. Again, we have the supposed soup of life, whatever that was at the beginning, and then eventually all these different forms of life coming from that base, the branches being based kind of on what's similar to each other, connecting it. Well, do you know that the tree of life has actually been cut down recently? And do you know who's cutting it down? It's science. Here's the evolutionary magazine, New Scientist. What does it say? Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life. Why would they do such a thing? We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. That's what they said. Why is that? Biology is vastly more complex than we thought. And facing up to this complexity will be scary. As we're continuing to dive deeper into cells, into DNA, into genetics, what are we finding? Less and less and less similarity. And so they're realizing we can't connect all these creatures together like we thought they were so similar. There are more differences than we realized existed. And this shouldn't astound us when we realize what Darwin, or here's a picture of Darwin's original drawing of the tree of life. And what does it say at the top left? I think. This is a man's idea, it's a man's theory. Not that I'm against thinkers and theorizers, no, but don't you realize the hazards of taking what someone says, I think, and saying, it is fact. It is fact without having evidence, right? Without having proved it through observation and experimentation, the building blocks of science. So does similarity prove evolution? No, it does not. We're actually finding that we are less similar to the supposed links that evolutionary scientists make between different creatures. Similarity does not prove that we evolved from other creatures. What about fossils? Fossils can be kind of interesting. So here's a chart of the different rock layers starting at the top, going down, and the different ages given for. This is kind of a time capsule of Earth history, so to speak, and we would expect, or evolutionary scientists expect, that you have the early life down below, and the evolutionary stages are also contained within the different rock layers of the different time periods, starting simple down below and eventually becoming more complex. Well, is that truly what we see in the rock layer? Shouldn't we see things being very simple down here in the Cambrian? Well, that's actually not what we find, just like this little guy, the trilobite here. We have two fossilized trilobites out on the table there. Unfortunately, my fossils do not have their eye. The eye of the trilobite is very complex. Look at that eye. Look at all those lenses that are on that trilobite. Here's a fossil that they found, over 3,000 lenses on the eye of a trilobite, and they said it looks like the squashed eyes of a recently swatted fly. Are flies' eyes complex? Oh yeah, they are very complex. Just try swatting one of those things. Man, they can see it coming. Their eyes are very complex, and what is this study? What did they say? Their discovery reveals that some of the earliest animals possessed very powerful vision. Similar eyes are found in many living insects. Really? Very powerful vision here down where life is supposed to be very uncomplex and very simple. But instead, we're finding complexity way down here at the bottom. And not only is there complexity in the trilobite, but there's a complexity in life in general. So many creatures that are being discovered way down below, but without connecting points. So they refer to it as the Cambrian explosion. All of a sudden, all these creatures, fully formed, come out of nowhere. Ariel Roth's PhD in zoology talks about this. the Cambrian explosion is not just a case of all the major animal phyla appearing about the same place in the geological column. It's also a situation of no ancestors to suggest how they might have evolved. Where did all these creatures come from? David Berlinski, an evolutionist, says there is no question that such a gap exists. A big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when a great number of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record. This sudden explosion of life that just suddenly popped up. But wait a minute, that's not what evolution teaches. It's slow, gradual processes from a common ancestor. But that's not what we find in the fossil record, even way down below. Suddenly, all these fully formed creatures are suddenly there. Where did they come from? Here, this encyclopedia talks about as well. One of the most difficult problems in evolutionary paleontology, by the way, paleontology is the study of fossils, has been the almost abrupt appearance of major animal groups, classes, and phyla in full-fledged form in the Cambrian and Ordovician periods. This must reflect a sudden acquisition of skeletons by the various groups, in itself a problem. Well, yes, maybe a problem for Darwinian evolution, but it's not a problem for what the Scriptures have to say, right? In fact, if the Bible is true and how it talks about how life began, we would expect two predictions from the fossil record. We would expect stasis, not change, things staying pretty much the same. And we would expect to find distinct kinds of animals, not animals halfway evolving into another kind. So let's look. Do we see seashells pretty much being seashells? Yes, even though there's supposedly millions of years between them, we don't see very much change. Sassafras leaves have been sassafras leaves. Not even the leaf pattern has changed in supposedly millions of years of evolution. Do these look familiar? Yeah, insects have been insects. They have not, we don't see the changes that supposedly should have been taking place over millions of years of evolution. Dragonflies have been dragonflies. Look, not even the angle of the wing has changed on the dragonfly. Ornithologist Margaret Rubega was given a fossil of a hummingbird, and she says, the amazing thing about this fossil is it's essentially a modern hummingbird. My mind is a little blown. And the interviewer adds, where the whole hovering tribe came from remains up in the air. We don't even know where the hummingbird came from, but also, in supposedly millions of years, it's just stayed the same. Hummingbirds have been hummingbirds. Conifers have always been conifers. Here's Live Science in 2012. If you were to travel back 100 million years and look for your Christmas tree, you would find firs nearly identical to the ones sold today. New research shows that the genome of conifers has hardly changed since the days of the dinosaurs. What do we see? Stasis, not change in the fossil record. Pine cones have always been pine cones. Sharks have always been sharks. Look what this museum says. The first shark evolved 450 million years ago. Sharks have changed very little over the years. Really? 400 million years of evolution, mutation, natural selection, all these building blocks of improving. No change. No change. What about the coelacanth? Coelacanth was supposed to be extinct for 7 million years, they thought. They found the fossil record and they said, we don't see it in the world today. 70 million years it's been extinct. But then fishermen off the coast of Madagascar reported that they were catching coelacanths. So scientists went to look how much has changed in the coelacanth in 70 million years. And what did they find? They looked pretty fishy. They hadn't changed. The coelacanth hadn't changed. It was still the same in the fossil record. Earl White says, whatever ideas authorities may have on the subject, the lungfishes, like every other major group of fishes that I know, have their origins firmly based on nothing. I have often thought how little I should like to have to prove organic evolution in the court of law. Why is he concerned about proving it in the court of law? Because what do you need in the court of law? Evidence. And what does he have? Nothing. I have no evidence for how this lungfish came about. No evidence for a previous ancestor, evolutionary ancestor. Dr. T.S. Kemp, the curator of zoological records or collections at Oxford University, says, in virtually all cases, a new taxon or type of animal appears for the first time in the fossil record with definitive features already present in practically no known Sten group forms. If the Bible was true, we would expect to see in the fossil record stasis and not change. And sure enough, that's what we find. Things are fully formed and they are staying the same. We would also expect to find distinct kinds not changing into another. You may see something like this before. Here they're showing the fish, it's trying to get its way onto land slowly, and it's eventually going to evolve into this creature. Well, this is great artwork, but when you see great artwork like this, I want to teach you to ask a question. The question you should ask is, what's the evidence? Okay, so when you see great artwork, what question should you ask? Well, what's the evidence for this great artwork? Nothing. Well, that shouldn't surprise us, because what does it say at the top left? Missing links. They're missing. They don't have the links. We have the fossils of fully formed creatures, but all the links in between them are missing. The missing links. We don't have the fossil evidence to show how these creatures evolved supposedly into another. Here's some more great artwork. Here is Pakicetus. Pakicetus, the ancestor supposedly of the whale, because the whale, he's a mammal, but he's in the ocean, so he must have previously been on land, and then eventually evolved and decided to go back into the water. So here was supposed to be the ancestor of the whale, Pakicetus. Well, when you see great artwork like this, what question should you ask? That's correct. So here's the evidence that they found. Oh, but it's not the whole skull. It's just the dark areas. All the white stuff is filler. Now, are those little pieces of skull really enough evidence to prove all the rest of that creature? I don't think so. It also is confusing that it says that the bones prove the whale walked. Really? You have no feet, no arms, no shoulders. You have pieces of skull, and that's enough to prove that this animal walked? I don't think that's sufficient evidence. And here's the latest view of Pakicetus now. Well, it's looking more like a rat to me, right? So much has changed. Here is another museum, whale ancestor jaw. Okay, so there's supposedly the creature. That's great artwork. When you see great artwork, what question should you ask? Yeah, what's the evidence for this? There you go. Piece of a jawbone. Really? That's enough to get not only the rest of that creature, but then to say this proves that this creature is a link to whales? I don't think that's enough evidence. Ariel Roth, PhD in zoology, says, we have virtually no evidence in the fossil records or elsewhere for any of the changes proposed during the immensity of time, but the public hears nothing of this problem. Here's evolutionist David Kitts writing in a magazine called Evolution. What does he say? Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. Fossils does not provide these intermediate forms. And Darwin knew this at his time as well. He says in his own book, geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chains. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. My explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. So what's he saying? We just need more time to unearth the fossils in the ground, and then we will eventually find them. Well, Niles Eldredge says, 120 years later of paleontological research, it has become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record. The fossil record simply shows this prediction is wrong. It's been tallied that we now have in our museums and collections all over the world up to 1 billion fossil specimens. 1 billion fossils. No intermediate forms found. No intermediate forms. If the Bible was true, we would expect to see stasis, not change, and just distinct kind of creatures, not creatures evolving into others. And sure enough, that's what we find in the fossil record. Well, some might say, well, wait a minute. I read National Geographic just like this, and here it says, dinosaurs take wing, the origin of birds. And they talk about how dinosaurs evolved into birds. And they have even a little chart here that shows dinosaurs on the left and them slowly evolving into birds on the right. Well, much could be said about what supposed discoveries they made, but if you were to turn this chart this way, wouldn't we expect in the geological record to find dinosaurs down below, birds way at the top, and maybe some intermediate in between? But is that what we find in the geological record? No, actually what we find, or what they have found since 1988, has been fossils of sandpipers, loons, ducks, flamingos, cormorants, and albatrosses in dinosaur rock layers. And in August 2012, PLUS ONE reported a theropod dinosaur fossil in China with 3 birds in its stomach. Dinosaurs weren't evolving into birds. They were eating birds. Parrots, owls, ducks, penguins, loons, robins, flamingos, all fossils of them have been found in dinosaur rock layers right next to the dinosaurs. And here is another sketch of the supposedly evolutionary family tree of dinosaurs. And it's important to read the fine print. What does it say? The tinted areas indicate solid fossil evidence. Well, which areas aren't tinted? All the connection points, all the intermediate connections between all. There's no solid evidence, fossil-wise, connecting any of them together. None. Ernest Meyer, professor of zoology at Harvard University, says, given the fact of evolution, he believes it, one would expect the fossils to document gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants. But this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series. Oh, but what about charts such as this? Surely we've seen things like this. Well, and that mankind came from apes. That's Uncle Harry, right? And there's Grandpa. But first of all, just because you can line up things like this, does that prove that they evolved? Does this prove how the fork came about? First there was the spoon, and then there was the spoon. No, just because you can line things up doesn't prove that it evolved. So when you see great artwork like this, what questions should you ask? Yeah, let's look at the evidence made for this guy over here. What did they find? Oh, there we go. Oh, but wait, it's not the whole skull, right? The white part is just filler. What did they find? They found the skull cap. The skull cap. That's it. That's all you found? And you created not only all the rest of the face, but all of the rest of the creature from just the skull cap? I don't think that that's enough evidence, is it? What about Piltdown Man? Piltdown Man was famous in the early 1900s. Scientists discovered at the top of the skull clearly looked like a human and the bottom like an ape. They said this proves that mankind evolved from apes. But as you can see there, it says Piltdown Man hoax, because actually a scientist took those 2 pieces that were found separately, stuck them together, buried them in the ground for a scientist to find. And of course, when the scientist found it, he said, look, this proves that we evolved from apes. And you can read, I actually have a newspaper clipping about it there on the table. But even after it was found that it was a hoax, that it was a fake, it continued to be in the textbook for decades, saying Piltdown Man, proof that we evolved from apes. What about Nebraska Man? Here's 1922, Nebraska Man. Well, there's some great artwork there. Whenever you see great artwork, what questions should you ask? Yeah, what was the evidence for Nebraska Man, 1922? The tooth, the whole tooth, and nothing but the tooth. Really? That's it? All you had was a tooth, and not only did you have him, but you also had his buddy coming from the tooth? Well, it turns out that tooth wasn't even from Nebraska Man. It was from the first Nebraska Cornhusker, and it was a pig's tooth. It wasn't even a human tooth. What about Ramapithecus? Here they say Ramapithecus, man ape, he was not a real man. He hadn't evolved fully into being a real man yet. All right, so we have Ramapithecus. When we see great artwork like this, what questions should we ask? Yes, what was the evidence for Ramapithecus? Here are some pieces of jawbone. Pieces of jawbone? Is that really enough evidence not only for the whole rest of the body, but even for his whole family? I don't think that that's enough evidence to prove that we evolved from apes. But what about Lucy? Lucy, probably one of the most famous of the findings. So here we have Lucy. She has a lovely face. She even has some whites around her eyes. I didn't know that fossils could tell you that they had whites around their eyes like human beings. She has nice hands. But actually, when you look at her fossil, they actually don't have her hands, nor do they have most of her face. Most of her face is missing. Well, the scientists that found her said, well, she looked more like a chimpanzee, but this knee bone proved that she walked upright like a human being. And as that scientist was going around talking about his findings at different seminars, someone finally raised their hand and said, did you find that knee bone with the rest of the body? No. Well, where'd you find it? Oh, it's about 100 yards that way and a little deeper in the rock layers. Well, why'd you stick it with her? Seemed to fit. And actually, they've created a whole family legacy for Lucy, and a lot of it includes the putting together of various pieces. Look here, Tim White made this reconstruction of an amphoracis skull using parts of several individuals. 107 separate pieces. He's just taking a little here, sticking them together and saying, look what we made. Look what we made from these various individuals. Is that really good science? Is that really good evidence? Here we have another article talking about another discovery that was found, and man, it was the toe bone. The toe bone was the key proof that this ape-looking creature was actually moving towards being a human, because the toe bone proved it walked on two legs. Well, even among evolutionary scientists, they didn't fully agree with this, as Time magazine talked about Johansen is dubious about categorizing the 5.2 million-year-old toe bone with the rest of the fossils. Why? Well, not only was it separated by time of several 100,000 years, but it was also found 10 miles away from the rest of the body. Really? We're just finding random pieces? And if I were to dig up the bumper of a car and the head of a bighorn sheep and I stuck them together, what would I get? A Dodge Ram. That's not good science, is it? That's not good evidence to prove the supposed ape-man evolutionary stages. And other evolutionary scientists also are concerned. Here, a French science journal says that the apes of the species Australopithecus do not represent the origin of man. They should be removed from the relevant family tree. They're saying, no, we do not believe that those are truly the right ancestors. That's wrong. And there have been more discoveries that are also throwing doubt on such lines that are being drawn. Here, the New York Times, 2007. 2 fossils found in Kenya have shaken the family tree, possibly rearranging major branches thought to be straight ancestral line to Homo sapiens. If this interpretation is correct, the early evolution genus of Homo genus is left in even more shrouded in mystery than before. S.J. Gould says, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists to be the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. D. Berlinski says, there are gaps in the fossil graveyard, places where there should be intermediate forms, but where there is nothing whatsoever instead. No paleontologist writing in English, French, or German denies that this is so. It's simply a fact. Darwin's theory and the fossil record are in conflict. Mark Ridley says, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Isn't it interesting? Why did he say that? Because the fossil record supports what the Bible says, that animals were created fully formed and reproduce after their own kind, but it does not support evolution, is what he is admitting. So, supposed proofs of evolution, do fossils prove evolution, Darwinian evolution? Not at all. Even evolutionary paleontologists have to admit it. It does not prove evolution. It is actually in conflict with the evolutionary mindset. No, what fossils do prove is that animals were created after their own kind, and they continue to remain that way over the period of Earth's history. So as you are seeing this great artwork, so to speak, these depictions of ape men, of ancestors, of intermediate forms, when you see that great artwork, what question should you ask? What's the evidence? Yes, such an important question, but not all evolutionists necessarily care about the evidence. Like the famous Richard Dawkins, what does he say? We don't need evidence. We know it to be true. Man, what a man of faith. I don't have as much faith as he does. Aren't you thankful that if you believe in the Bible, you have evidence to back up what you believe? But Richard Dawkins is saying, even if we have no evidence, we're still going to believe it. Man, he's got a lot of faith, more faith than I have. Proofs of evolution, no. Change, similarity in fossils. We see that they don't prove Darwinian evolution. They don't prove that animals are changing from one kind to another, or that took place supposedly millions of years ago. Those are not proofs of evolution. So now I want to open it up to question and answer time. If you have some questions that you want to ask now, I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to help out if there's maybe something I didn't cover, something that's been bugging you for a while. I'm opening it up right now. Yes.
On your geological column and the range of the date or the time difference between the bottom and the top, I don't know. But does anybody in the creation camp ever say or suggest that maybe God created the world with a fossil record? Is that ever thought as a possibility?
No, I believe most would say that there were not fossils in the earth when it was created, because that would suggest creatures died and there was no death prior to the fall of man. And you win a fossil for asking a question. That's right. Ask a question, win a fossil. I've upped the stakes. Yes, Jim.
How does that make possible? I kill a deer that goes up, and if I don't do something with it, it'll rot in 10 minutes.
That's correct. Most fossilization doesn't happen slow, or what we see around us. It needs to be some special conditions, something being buried rapidly, and also being kept away from decay and from the air, and certain minerals then replacing it. Fossilization can take place today, though. Don't misunderstand me. I think we even found fossils of human beings. I think there's one of a human foot in a boot that they found, and the foot was fossilized, and the leather boot was still around it, of course not fossilized. And that, of course, was because where the person died, the certain minerals and stuff were great for replacing the human bone and tissue with fossilization. So it depends kind of on the mineral content, on heat. Heat is also an important part of fossilization temperature, and also the pressure and deposit on top of it as well. A lot of different things involved in fossilization. Yes?
There's no evidence in the craziness that they're showing. Are they changing the books in the schools to show that more towards God and not towards Darwin?
I have not studied the modern textbooks these days, but I would say in general that no, that is not the case, that Darwinian evolution still persists to be a modern or a very popular view held by universities, educational institutes, and so that is portrayed in the textbooks as well. Whatever evidence they supposedly will have, maybe more modern day evidence, they'll put that in there and portray it as proof of evolution. Yes?
So if the world was created, but the gap between, the geological records say the Earth is older than the Bible says, because if the world was created, it would be a lot younger, and there would be a lot less things, because according to the records, it goes back to millions and billions of years. So.
Yeah, that's a good question. We did see on there that the rock layers were dated for millions of years. But of course, that dating is based off of various things, such as the idea that those rock layers were formed slowly and gradually over millions of years. But as we'll talk about later at Noah's flood in geology, a lot of rock layers actually were laid down during Noah's flood. Not slow and gradual processes, but actually rapidly being laid down. So scientists, understandably, scientists today, they look around and they say, how are rock layers being formed today? Well, yeah, they are being formed usually. Slow, gradual processes are forming rock layers today. But the problem then is to say that's how it's always been throughout human history. See the danger in that? Assuming that what we see today is how it has always been back and back and back. Because that's not what the Bible says. It says, no, there was a climactic geological event that took place, Noah's flood, that then laid down so many of those layers very rapidly. But the idea that persists nowadays is it's slow, gradual laying down of rock layers, which, yes, we observe mostly today, But in history, we can't always assume that that's the way that rock layers were always laid. And we'll actually get into that, where there actually was more recent geological events where rock layers were laid very rapidly, such as Mount St. Helens proved that as well. We saw rock layers being deposited very rapidly in a short period of time. It does not always have to be slow and gradual. Yeah.
So maybe you might have some insight on why certain animals have incisors, like canine teeth, and they were created in a time where there was no death, and so there was no need to eat those kind of teeth. So I understand there's animals out there right now that eat just vegetables that have sharp teeth, but it's kind of just boggles my mind why the sharp teeth, canine teeth, were created anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we could maybe assume that canine teeth or sharp teeth are always for the tearing of flesh, but that's not the case. Sharp teeth can also be used for breaking other things, right? There are bats that have very sharp teeth that they use to break into fruit. They need to pierce the outside of certain fruit that are very tough to get into. And even for something like dinosaurs, that we say, man, look at the sharp teeth on those dinosaurs. Why did God create them with such sharp teeth? Well, we don't have necessarily all the answers, other than perhaps what they were eating was difficult to get into. We have some fossil records showing these very large pineapples, and that these pineapples seem to have very thick outer layers, kind of like the pineapples we have today. Well, if you today are trying to chomp into a pineapple without cutting it, that's going to be pretty tough. That's not going to feel very good. But if you have nice teeth built into your mouth that you can then pierce it and eat it at the same time, well, that makes it much more easier. So perhaps that's part of why God was creating animals with such sharp teeth, to be able to pierce the various fruits and nuts and vegetation that existed. I'll get to you in a second, but let's.
Yes, could be sharp teeth for their own survival, to protect themselves.
Well, yeah, but he was saying prior to the fall, so you wouldn't need to protect yourself if there was no death or animals trying to kill each other prior to the fall, is what he was saying. Yes, back there.
Would two fossils, like, for the same thing, be considered one, or would it be considered...
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Would two fossils found, like, far apart be considered one, or, like, if they fit together, would it be considered one, or if they weren't considered two, would it be considered...
I mean, yeah, if they truly fit together, I could imagine that somehow in the, geological activity that exists today, like earthquakes and stuff that can break up rock layers and could potentially break, fossils in half. If they're in that crack zone, they could rip them and move them apart. That's sure, they could still technically still be one. But something like finding a knee bone and then finding a leg bone and then saying, well, I think that fits that joint. It's like, well, I don't know if that's actually accurate. Yes?
I was just wondering, what are some of the scientific methods being used today? And we were talking about that.
Jesse, we can't hear the questions back here.
And
We can't hear you either.
prove that their reliable methods are dependable. So what
Okay.
are those being used today?
Okay, so the question is, what scientific methods are being used today to evaluate or prove what?
Maybe fossilization time.
Okay, so maybe fossilization time, and yeah, doing study in time of geology, again, that's a difficult process because we weren't around 10,000 or even supposedly 10 million years ago. No one's around to be like, okay, let's see what's happening right now to date how old this fossil or this rock layer is. So one of the methods that is used is called radioactive decay dating. So it's looking at the decay rate of atoms today, and taking those and saying, well, we'll look at what atoms exist in rocks now, and if we know the decay rate now, we can reverse that and say, well, before it was decaying, when it was first formed, then we'll take that rate of decay and we'll figure out how long did it take for it to decay to the point now that exists. But the problem with that, though, is that there are some assumptions being made, and I think we'll unpack that a little bit for the geology one as well, looking at radioactive decay dating, is that it's assuming what was in the rock to begin with. What was in that rock when it was first formed, how much and so forth is being assumed, and then also it's being assumed that the decay rate has always been the same. Again, we can't know for sure if atoms have been decaying always at the same rate over time. It could be that atoms weren't decaying early on, which would make sense maybe from a creation standpoint. God didn't create the world to decay originally, and we see that with the age of man, right? That we see mankind living for hundreds of years, and now mankind isn't living that long. We see an increased rate of decay, it seems, now than what was then back then. And perhaps that was the same for atoms decaying. Maybe atoms decay more now than they did thousands of years ago. But again, those things aren't being included. It's usually just a set formula of a decay rate and saying that's how it's always been, so that's how we'll gauge this age. And you'll get various ages because of that. And so there's also some other stuff that I'm not covering in how they date rocks and fossils as well.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, the people that did the radiation dating, if I'm not mistaken, there's a really hand-in-glove relationship between them and paleontologists. And so there's a severe conflict of interest. And they're so inaccurate, they're just basically saying they don't know. The other thing is, to comment to the people, why do people have incisors, is that falls within the same bracket of we're started as a man, but that was thousands of years ago, and the diet actually changed after the flood to meat. So if mankind were to eat more meat, it's possible that they would adapt and grow incisors, and fully be within the realms of the same kind, but just minor adaptations.
Yeah, just like Darwin's finches, there's an adaptation in the beak, right, based off of what type of food is available. Well, it could be that God has designed, knowing the fall would happen, that He designed for us to be able to have our teeth to adapt to a degree over time to accommodate our change in diet as well. So that could be another reason for what we see, not only in ourselves, but also in other animals with very sharp, jagged teeth. And what was also mentioned there was that there's a conflict sometimes between rock layers and fossils because there's an idea of how long ago an animal existed, but then the rock layer sometimes is even much older that it's in than the creature was. It's like, wait a minute, that creature should be more up, and that rock layer is too old, and sometimes, yeah, there is that conflict that happens in dating the fossil and the rock layer, or the rock layer that the fossil is in. Oh, yes, thank you.
So this whole idea of Darwin came up with evolution, this was only based on the finches he studied, or was like I remember doing when we had I was in junior high, we had to get on this, and I was just kind of, I had a lot of questions about it, I just quite believed it all, I mean, so it was kind of like sense of what I believe, you know, what I learned in church and all. So did he only come up with this idea just from finches, or was there what it was like?
There were other things involved as well, but the finches is kind of... Oh, yeah, thank you. So she was asking if Darwin's finches, or the finches that he saw, was the primary driving force for him coming up with this theory of evolution. And no, there were other things driving his idea as well, but the finches were something that he observed. He's like, oh, I can see, and I can document, and I can show people this evidence.
Yeah. I remember I remember the finches in school. I remember when we'd see, like, it was just the beak, but then in the end, it's like, but it's a bird still. It's like nothing new. So I guess that's where, anyway, yeah. But I just knew that book was really good.
Yeah, we do see change within a kind, but we have no observational evidence of one kind changing into another. No observational evidence whatsoever. Got 2 more fossils up here. All right. Oh, yes.
I'm sorry, I think one of my, I just wanted to share this full definition. I was in this a couple months ago, this seminar, and it was this, like, I teach third grade science where I work, and one of the best definitions that I've ever been told what science really means is that it's the study of God's world. And that's something I always want to make sure to remind everyone when we talk in science, that it's the study of God's world. So just overall, it's very
Well, thank you. Yeah, so she was just saying something that she learned what she liked is the definition of science is the study of God's world. That we do seek to observe and experiment with what God has provided, and ultimately we are able to make scientific discoveries based off of that. Well, thanks again for your time, and hopefully I've helped to encourage you that if you do open God's Word and read it, that you truly can stand firm on God's Word to say, man, it is true from the first verse all the way to the last verse, and there is evidence that supports some of the things that the Bible claims. How about we end with a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for proof of your handiwork that exists in the world today, Lord. You have not left us without evidence of who you are, what you have done, and really our purpose here on earth. And so, Lord, we are thankful for such evidence that we can stand on, though indeed it still is faith. We didn't observe you creating the world. It still takes faith, but we do have evidence supporting the truth of your word, Lord, and we're thankful for that. And may it encourage these people as they stand on the rest of your word and the salvation that you offer to all mankind through Christ. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.